I'm speaking today to the author of this book, Raga to Rock, Mr. Madan Mohan. So I just want to start by asking you why you chose the title Raga to Rock. Because it's a very catchy title, but how did you come up with it? Why did you decide this particular title?
Okay, so first of all, regarding the title, I will give full credit to my father, about whom I always tell him that you should have been a copywriter or in the ad industry,
Yeah,
because he is the one who can come up with these really punchy lines, and he doesn't have the patience to write 30,000, whatever word book. So that's my trump card. I have the patience to do that. But if you ask him to write a entertaining short story of 1,000 words or something, then he will just, do a brilliant job of that. So it was like he who came up with the title, but of course the essence, it came from me because I wanted to capture the fact that I actually started from a very much Indian film music oriented background, especially Hindi in those days in the 90s. And then somewhere along the line, all this rock or jazz, blues, even Western classical, everything happened. Because normally what happens is that you're born into a so-called upper crust household where there's all this kind of music already happening around you. You know what they call Peter in
yeah,
Tamil Nadu kind of culture, Peter reference. So yeah, like that. Or Soboites in Mumbai. But I'm
yeah.
not from that kind of background at all. Like my place, the place where I grew up, Kalyan, that's 50 kilometers from the center of Mumbai, which I've written the book, of course.
Yeah.
So, there was nobody who used to listen to that kind of stuff. I think there was one guy who had a Madonna cassette among my neighbors, and that's it. So I did not know anybody at the time who was into any of the kind of music that I listen to now. But
Right.
somewhere along the line, yeah, sorry.
You know, you grew up in the 90s, but your book
Yeah.
ends in the 1950s, 80s, and you take the time to trash 90s music, which is quite popular because no one thinks the 90s are the worst in music, right? They would say that the 80s, the 90s sure doesn't get the pride place like the 50s or 60s does, but you trash it quite hard. You went after Kumar Sanu, you were after Anu Malik. All of them are very popular even today. You see the views that even like songs from movies like Janwar also get on YouTube are quite surprising. I'm pretty sure you hate Raja Hindustani also in that same line, the music release. So how does a person who grew up in the 90s not like 90s music, but like 50s, 60s, and 70s music? That most people go to when they're older, right? You don't start your childhood liking that.
Yeah, I think so. It just happened. I can't put a finger on it, like why it was like that. It's just sometimes maybe your tastes are passed on to you through your gene pool or something. I don't know. Because it was definitely not an issue of not getting exposed to that music. No, it's true that my father had an intense dislike for, Kumar Sanu. He does like Udit Narayan. By the way, even I like Udit Narayan as a singer. I may not necessarily like the songs that he was on, and not all. I wouldn't be, very like trashing each and everything. Like I like the music of Kabhi Ha Kabhi Na. I think we have talked about it in
Yeah.
Via's blog. So yeah, so like there are exceptions, so to speak. The Kamoshi soundtrack that Jatin Lalit came up for Sanjay Leela, that's actually a wonderful soundtrack. For some reason, Mr.
How could
Bansali
that?
didn't
Yeah.
like it, which mystifies me completely. But anyway, that apart. I like I used to like the song, the scores for Tom and Jerry cartoons, and I liked stuff like Jungle Book music. So I don't know why that happened. There were a lot of, my classmates, schoolmates. They all used to listen to these 90s Hindi songs. And funnily, many of them were not interested in what Rahman was doing in the 90s. So I think that was also part of the equation.
Yeah.
At least from, Bombay onwards, I was very, very much into what Rahman was doing in both Tamil and Hindi. And I
Uh-huh.
couldn't help contrast that somewhere with what these other guys were doing, who I thought like at that time that they were unfairly hogging all the assignments. When you look back, Rahman used to work mostly with Mani Ratnam in the
Yeah,
90s or
yeah.
Shankar, their Hindi dub films were the ones that he was doing in Hindi. Only Subhash Ghai broke the mold and went with Invotal, but
I
the other
think, I
directors
think,
didn't.
I think you missed Rangila because Rangila was the one
Yeah,
that
oh yeah.
really,
I was going to
yeah,
say that. I was going to bring up Ram Gopal Verma also. So again, a South director. See,
yeah.
South. So Ram Gopal Verma, Mani Ratnam from the South, Shankar again. So why did none of these other guys think that Rahman's music was so fascinating when the entire nation seemed to? That's something I've never got the answer for. So somewhere I couldn't help but contrast. Rahman's music was produced so brilliantly. It sounded amazing even on cassette. And then you take this ashiki music and all, it's super tacky. I'm sorry to say that. I'm not going to mince words, which I said in the preface of my book also. But it's just even at that time it sounded super tacky to me. So don't ask me what I think about it today. So I know. So I couldn't help contrast that somewhere. I think so. I actually take a different view that then when Shankar Ehsaan Loy happened, then they really upped the ante for at least the way Hindi music sounded. Now you can debate on the originality, whether they're cliche, whether they repeat themselves, all that, but at least it sounds good. That it took until then, and then the others were also compelled to follow suit. Otherwise, they were very comfortable in their comfort zone.
Jhanka
They were just repeating everything that you heard already at the beginning of the 90s. The music didn't change that much all the way till 99 or 2000. Then when Dil Chahta Hai happened, they had no choice. They had to change, and those who didn't change, of course, they started losing assignments. So I would say that that was a big part of the reason why I really didn't get into what Nadeem Shravan and Jatin Lalit I'll have a soft corner for, but definitely Nadeem Shravan or Anu Malik. I mean, Anu Malik, but I will give credit where due. Anu Malik did come up with a brilliant song many years later, and that is Moh Moh Ke Dage, which was for Damla Ke Eyes. I mean, that was a brilliant song, absolutely brilliant song. And even he said that there is a kind of a hunger inside a composer to do something even after all this success, and that's what he tapped into for this song. So I think that's a tacit acknowledgement from him that perhaps in the 90s he was just doing whatever was commercially successful, because Anu Malik actually did some good songs in the 80s. I think Kishore has sung some good songs for him actually. They're really good songs, but at the time he couldn't stand out and distinguish himself from the older composers. And then he tapped into this Bazigar formula and he ran with it, which I don't blame him for, but it's not music that I like.
Yeah. So, and being a 90s kid, I found it quite curious that you didn't mention indie pop because indie pop was really at its peak in the 90s. Baba Sehgal, Falguni Pathak, Alisha Chinay, Made in India was a very big hit. So I'm
Yes,
surprised
yes.
indie pop because that was the one time that you had independent musicians who were quite successful in Indian history, the 90s, which is probably why Ashiki and you had these heartbroken singers and all Dil To Pagal Hai. That made more sense in that context. So how come there's no indie pop in your book? Because I think
So I
there's
would
been
say
some good work in indie pop. I
the reason
quite
for that is simply that I was keeping it focused to film music. That's all. Because if
right.
I'd really wanted to, I could have gone further back into the 80s, Thriller Good 2 and all. I've mentioned that in very much in passing in one of the subsections in the Rahman chapter that
Right.
they started doing exciting work in the 80s, and that kind of
Yeah.
continued. Indie pop was a more mainstream manifestation of that. It
Right.
was, yes, it was fresh, and it offered a solid alternative to what was going on in the Bollywood for sure. That
Right.
was actually a very exciting phase for independent music in India. And
Right.
unfortunately, by the 2000s, CDs happened and then downloading, and that just killed the independent music, at least in a recorded format. You have
Yeah.
live stuff happening now, live events, and they're
Yeah.
going to get costlier and costlier. That's my prediction, at least. The top 1%, just like in anything else in the world today, top 1% are going to hog all the money. But at that time, you had a kind of a democratic setup where you get all this new, fresh, exciting music at the same price as the cassette for Bazigar or Raja Hindustani, whatever. We had a cassette of Colonial Cousins. That's another one. That was very nice music again. Yeah,
Yeah,
you can say it's not as earth shattering as Rahman, but that's that's an unrealistic standard. Everybody doesn't have to be as amazing as Rahman to be called good. That
yeah.
then like you're not going to like 90% of the music in the world.
So I'd say that you're using the same standard for 90s music also.
I'm sorry.
I could say you're using the same standard for 90s music also. When you're saying you're comparing with Rahman, 90s music. So
Well, okay, but there, the gap for me at least is just
yeah,
way too much. So again, coming back to production, Colonial Cousins, the sound was really good. The
yeah,
same thing with Made in India. The sound was really fresh and it sounded very professional. I really missed that in Bollywood. And that's not just the music, even the way the movies were put together. It was really, if you just watch a nice Tamil film made by Shankar or Maniratnam, and the production values were like light years ahead of what
yeah,
these guys were doing. So they were in a comfort zone. So that's just the way I see it.
yeah. So another curious thing about your book is it goes in a non-chronological order when it comes to the composers. So the first chapter starts with Shankar Jack. I was quite surprised by this because I just fed myself started S.D. Burman and then go down. But then R.D. Burman comes before S.D. Burman and Lakshmikant Terar comes in between them. So, why did you take this approach? Because it can be quite confusing to a normal reader. Or
So
is
yeah,
there
I
some musical thing you're trying to explore the different, maybe the basics of music or something like that? What are you going for
Yeah, I mean, part of it is related to the kind of music they all represented, and the other part is where, at what points they started to make an impact, an impression on me. So,
here?
if you read the chapters, you can see that I mentioned Kaun Hai Jo Sapno Mein Aaya as my entry point for Shankar Jackson. That was back in
Yeah,
1990. I was just 5 years or so at that time,
yeah,
but I still, I still even remember the sound of the chap who was playing guitar with my father while rehearsing the song. He was playing the
yeah,
second interlude on guitar. So that was the kind of impression it left on me. And then R.D. Burman, when he died, it was a massive event at that time. So it
yeah,
was all over the papers. Then S.D. Burman happened a little later. So you see S.D. Burman, Naushad,
yeah,
Salil, they all come later. Actually, their music is a little bit, harder to crack in terms of infectiousness. You have to get more discerning, you have to get more observant of different aspects of music, and then you can really start to see why they were brilliant. With Shankar Jaikishan, they used to specialize in very simple catchy melodies,
yeah,
so you get into them very quickly.
yeah,
And I'm not going to say that they are necessarily all that inferior to Naushad or SD Burman, which is a kind of popular narrative today. They all have their different strengths and weaknesses, but they are just easier to get into. Now, Shah, does your taste do have to mature a little until you are kind of comfortable with waiting that long for the gratification, because he does demand some patience. So, though, the Madan Mohan, my namesake,
yeah,
he happened pretty late again to me. So,
yeah.
because again, his music is a little more demanding, other than songs like Zarurat Hai, they are just
Lag Ja
exceptions, but
Gale.
is really core, like pathos, ghazal kind of song. It takes more effort to get into. For that matter, Ilaiya happened much later.
But the Tamil music comes in a chronological order. And so
Yeah.
you're telling me you saw M.S. Vishwanathan before Ilaiya and Ilaiya before AR. Or,
So not exactly that
yeah,
way, not exactly that way, but what was happening was Tamil. I would, it would just trickle into my household because I know I was living in Mumbai at the time, and I would get exposed to Tamil music through my relatives or my mother. So at that time, I kind of knew about this man called Ilaiya. This bald face already registered in my mind because I had seen it on a photograph. But I was not yet like thinking about different composers and the music the way I was probably already starting to with Hindi. And my mother had a cassette where she had old MSV songs. So I actually remember them pretty well. And that was so, so that it actually happened all in the space of 3 or 4 years. So I can't really pinpoint which came first in the case of Tamil. Because actually, to be frank, Rahman was the one I was really, really into at that time in the
yeah,
90s. And with Ilayaraja and MSV, the exploration actually happened much later, in a deep sense of really
Right.
connecting to their work. That happened much later. So I can't really separate that the way I can with Hindi. With Hindi, I can really point to different moments. Another thing I will say is that with Tamil, I took a more kind of analytical approach. I think that comes out in the writing. In Hindi, I
Right.
tapped more into a kind of nostalgic vein. I actually at that time I had written a blog post about 90s nostalgia and all. I wrote about how things started changing in the 90s. And I remember people who used to read my writing on FB, they liked it. So I captured the same tone for the chapters on Hindi composers. But for in Tamil, I went much deeper for Ilayaraja and Rahman. Not so much for MSP, obviously, but for Ilayaraja and Rahman, I took a more analytical approach.
Right. So, and also somewhere in Tamil film music, it seems like you were really in a hurry to get to Ilaiya and Rahman because your thesis essentially is that Hindi film music was at its peak and was pretty groundbreaking and really incredible in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. After the 70s, the melody, as you say, went south, or the music went south,
Went
and
south.
you're just using MSV as a sort of introduction to how the state of Tamil music was pre-Ilayaraja.
Yeah.
That is your thesis.
Yeah.
So could you just elaborate on that? And why do you think, Hindi melody went south? And how did Tamil music respond to it? And what was the dramatic break that Ilayaraja brought that made
Right.
leapfrog ahead of Hindi music in that way?
Right. So I think this comes back a little bit to what we were chatting about on the Telugu composers also, that the sense of arranging music and
Yeah,
also an arc. So if you take, for example, a classic example, Chura Liya Hai Tumne Yadon Ki Barat, it
yeah,
becomes Neela Nayangalil in Tamil in Nale Namade film. So
yeah,
if you take the Antara, especially of Neela Nayangalil, it kind of meanders. That's criticism, a very mild criticism I have of MSV.
yeah,
That doesn't make his music bad or not even not good in any sense, but you don't really get an arc to latch on to. In Hindi, if you take Yadon Ki Barat, even the title track, the melody builds up and up in the antara up to a kind of a crescendo. You
yeah,
rarely used to get that, especially in the 70s in MSV's work. He went into a very heavily melody focused direction. It was his strength was melody, so he was more interested in exploring that deeply in the 70s. In the 60s, it was a little different. His melodies would tend to be simpler and again more catchy and straight to the point in their quality. But in the 70s, he began to meander around because he was just trying to play around with melody. He was experimenting, and there was nobody else. There was no competition for him, so why not? But the downside of that was that when Aradhana happened, then
right,
especially in Chennai, people became more interested in Hindi music. And I think you can't remove the Rajesh Khanna factor from that. It was
yeah,
definitely a factor in propelling the popularity of R.D. Burman's music. I mean, it was also that they were that much interested in Rajesh Khanna, the
yeah.
actor, as they were in R.D. Burman's music. So both put together, they really, help spread Hindi music in a big way in Tamil Nadu, which would, today you would say it's unthinkable, or today or for the anywhere in the last 30, 40 years, it just doesn't happen anymore.
I
But
mean,
at that time,
yeah. To
I'm sorry?
interject, I always remember my grandparents. Even now, they tell me, you know, Hindi songs were better than the Telugu songs or the Tamil songs. So I think it was a very common perception, even during the 60s and 70s, that the
It
Hindi
might
songs were
be. I
always
mean,
better than. I mean, sure, maybe because of their cultural background in specific, maybe they
see,
feel,
better is a very subjective word in music,
yeah,
So I don't. If you noticed, I didn't try to get into music Olympics in
yeah,
the book. That was the whole point of separating out composers in sections.
yeah.
So let's just talk about the composer and
Yeah,
not
I
about
don't mean
comparing.
better in the sense that maybe there was a perception even during the 50s and
Yes.
60s that Hindi
So I
songs
think
were
it comes
more
down to
sentimental, more
yeah,
popular,
yeah. It comes
and
down to more catchy kind of
yeah,
quality that Hindi music had. And
yeah,
again, like arrangements, like I think arrangements was not really MSV's great strength. Again, this is
right,
not to say that he was bad at it by any means. I mean, they all earned their place. You can't say that they're
yeah,
bad in any respect. But
yeah,
if you would compare to what even the Hindi guys did in the 60s, and then when R.D. Burman happened, it was just revolutionary compared to what
yeah,
was going on in Tamil music. You just couldn't compare. So that really opened up a big gap. And that was the gap that Ilayaraja was able to close because I mean, he went on with arrangements. He went beyond where any of the Hindi guys could go. And R.D. Burman said that to him very like candidly that like you are light years ahead of us. He said that. So I mean, good on him for saying that because I don't know, to be honest, whether Ilayaraja would say that about anybody who is younger than him as a composer. But R.D. Burman was gracious enough to say that to him, and even Naushad singled him out for praise. He was talking to reporters and he said Hindi music is in a terrible place today, but if you really want to hear good music you should listen to what Ilayaraja is doing. So this was a kind of perception maybe in the intelligentsia in the 80s. The media at the mass level didn't acknowledge this, but there were actually people paying attention to what Ilayaraja was doing up north also
yeah.
within the
I mean,
industry.
one story I've heard about this is I remember Kamal at some interview mentioning that apparently he used to go to Adi Burman and like play Ilayaraja's songs to him. So that's quite possible it was Kamal who introduced Ilayaraja's music to Burman and to the other Hindi composers. Or is this Kamal just, bragging about himself? Yeah.
You really don't know because Kamal came up with this story that sounds very much made up about Hey Ram, like some incident that happened while composing, or the composing sessions of Hey Ram were going on, or rather when they were being recorded, at Budapest, as if to say that the musicians there didn't understand what Ilayaraja was doing, and he said, colonize this and then he said that they used to colonize us, and look, now I was so proud to see that Ilayaraja is they are they are playing to Ilayaraja's baton, but actually Ilayaraja himself doesn't look at music like that. He has a more universal view of music. So yeah, it's possible that Kamal made it up, but again he was
Connectivity
working
Yeah,
issues.
hi
We're
Sudeep.
back on.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean he sang for Adi Burman instead of him. No,
Yes, RD did Kamal sing for RD Burman? I'm not. I think yeah, he did in Sagar. I think there was one song where he did
yeah,
sing. I'm not very sure, no, but I think he did. Right, I'm not very sure. It could have been SPB also, for all I know. But either way, but they did do a few. He was doing a few films in Hindi, which were either scored by Lakshmikant Pyarelal or RD Burman. So and actually the thing is that Sigapur Ojakal was remade in Hindi
yeah,
as Red Rose with Rajesh Khanna. So maybe that was the entry point for R.D. Burman, that he noticed that what kind of score Ilayaraja had made, and there's an incident that's narrated often. That's where he made that light years comment that R.D. Burman had organized some huge orchestra of 100 violins for the background music of Red Rose, and he invited Ilaiya over to the session, and he said, "Look, I've got 100 violins for you." And then Ilaiya said that, "But we don't need 100 violins for this film." And then he kind of did some arrangement right there on the spot and showed him, and he was like, "Oh, you're so far ahead of us," like that. So that's actually where that comment came from.
right. So and also when it comes to even Tamil music, there's this, now that Natu Natu has won the Oscar, I've always thought
Yeah,
Kiravani is one of those composers who was stuck in the post Raja and pre Rahman space, where you could say that about a lot of other composers who were contemporaries of Rahman. Though they were contemporaries, they didn't really get his sound the way people say 5 years after Rahman's debut, like the Telugu composer Mani Sharma or Vidya Sagar in Tamil, they got the sound. They didn't get that sound. So these composers like Kiravani or Deva, or I think Kiravani calls himself Margatamani in Tamil. I'm not sure. He's got
yeah.
three different
I
names.
mean, his name itself has been all over the place, so maybe that's part of the problem because people get confused sometimes when
Yeah,
they're talking about.
yeah.
He was Cream at one point, then Maragadamani, then he's now
There's this funny story about it that he had a fight with the producer, and the producer said, "I'm changing you." So he goes in, and then I think he was listening to the album of Shore or something, Sur, one of the Mahesh
Okay.
Bhatt movies. He hears Gali Mein
Okay.
Aaj, he hears that song and he's like, I want this guy. Who's this guy? MM Cream. And then the assistant has
Uh,
to tell him MM Cream and Keeravani are the same guy.
okay. Okay.
So
Okay.
yeah. So
So
what
I
do you
think
make?
Cream is kind of an enigma because once in a while he will come up with these songs that capture imagination, not just
Yeah,
in Telugu or Tamil, but even at a pan-India level. I mean, as a diehard Ilaiya fan, I will say that he was completely unsuccessful at that. He could never. I mean, maybe he just didn't make the effort for that. Whatever the reason is, he didn't really come up with a pan-India sound. But Tu Mile was a very big hit in
yeah,
the 90s, for
yeah.
example. Then there was this other song that Alka
Jadoo
Yagnik
hai,
sang. I can't remember what's. No, no,
Gali mein
Alka
aaj
Yagnik
chand
in the
nikla.
90s.
Gali mein aaj chand nikla.
Yeah, Chand Nikla, yes, yes, Chand Nikla. And again, yeah, Jism came after so many years and still it made a big splash.
Yeah,
So, and he has this kind of mellow, introspective sound. So, interestingly, I was discussing with some Americans on a chat, that they, congratulated myself and one other Indian in the chat for the award for Natu Natu. And I was telling them, actually, the interesting thing is, Natu Natu is so different from the kind of sound that we know Cream for because of these kind of melodic, introspective songs.
yeah. But
Actually,
but
that's what.
in
Yeah, tell me.
Telugu, Keeravani has had a lot of huge hit dance numbers. I'm not sure if you know this
Yeah.
song called Bangaru Kodi Petta.
No.
It was this very big Chiranjeevi hit song, So Chiranjeevi is dancing the heck out of it. He's dancing, but then Ramsir and NTR combined in Natu Natu. I'll maybe share that video with you. So Kiravani actually was doing these dance bits, but he was always more
Right.
into it. It always felt the perception was his heart was more into the introspective songs that he gave out in Hindi.
Correct.
It was always
Correct.
that
Correct.
that happened. He also had a lot of songs in Tamil also, but it always felt like G. Kiravani was the Hindi song guy. So how
So
do
yeah, he has a way of like transcending the his southern roots when he does those Hindi songs. If you told someone that Tu Mile or Jadoo Hai Nasha is composed by a Telugu composer, most people wouldn't believe it. I mean, people who don't know, they wouldn't believe it because it sounds very much like a Hindi song, but it's actually done by Cream. So I mean, that's really hats off to him because I don't know how he was able to absolutely get into that space and still retain his identity.
yeah? And talking about composers moving to other industries, what difference do you see in the Tamil A.R. Rahman and the Hindi A.R. Rahman? And why do you think Rahman did not work in Tamil as much as he did in the 90s when it came to the 2000s and even in the early 2010s? He only came back to Tamil after Tamasha. He was not doing such regular work except for Mani Ratnam and Shankar.
So I think this is something that I didn't really go into in the book, but I have a theory about this that the film started changing in the 2000s. 90s was very much a kind of class yuppie space in Tamil. That's why it was a good time for Prashant because
Yeah,
Prashant's only real qualification is that he looks very urban and sophisticated. His acting is just doki doki to be very polite, about it. But he was in all these kind of urban centric films. So that sound, that space really suited Rahman's sound to a T. But then in the 2000s, Vijay and Ajit start going mass, and even Vikram to some extent on Dul or Sami. And that really doesn't gel so well with Rahman's sound. And I think at that time he was kind of feeling like he's done everything he can in Tamil. He was doing a lot of films all of a sudden from around 99 to 2001, 2002. He was doing lots and lots of films. I mean, it may not be a lot if you compare to Ilaiya, but for Rahman standards, he was doing nine or 10 films a year. So that was a lot. So I think he kind of felt saturated there. He wanted to do something different. And that's where when he started having more success in Hindi, especially post Lagan, he started focusing more on that. And then after the Oscars, he started getting more work in Hollywood. So he went over there because again, I think Rahman wants to consciously, actively explore something different. That is a very key aspect in which he's different from just about everybody else before him. All the others, once they found their trademarks, stamp
Yes.
or signature or style that you call them, they stuck to it. But Rahman is not satisfied with that. He gets bored of that. And because he's so good at sound engineering and production, he brings that skill to bear to actually make the
Yes.
sound different. That was a little more difficult for the composers before him. Even if they wanted to do something different, they would have to do it within their existing framework. But Rahman can play around with the keyboard, the computer. So, he's very confident that he can produce a much different sound if he wants to. So I think he was seeking out those kind of experiments, and he wasn't really seeing where Tamil can, give that to him. So just recently, he was giving an interview in Tamil where the interviewer asked him, like, it's great that you're doing all these Tamil films again over the last 2 3 years, but what really happened? And he said, during COVID, my mother was not well, so I wanted to spend time with her, which was not possible staying in LA. So that's why I came over and I started doing all these Tamil films. So it just happened, coincidentally. It doesn't seem like even now he was actively seeking out Tamil films again. They just fell into his lap. So you could say maybe the directors have been waiting for him to come back, and he has probably been, limiting the number of Tamil assignments he takes. That's probably what has been happening.
Right. So, also, I think the time is running out, so I'll put another meeting now, just so that
Yeah,
and yeah, for some reason Zoom is just not working with me today.
sure.
I also wanted to ask, with Rahman, the very obvious thing is he came at the right time and he came at the right place, right? He was there when Maniratnam was trying to break to a pan-India level, when Shankar was trying to break to a pan-India level. He had the right film. There was this Tamil new wave that was happening, where there was Bhalachandra, there was Bharti Raja, then there was Balu Mahendra, all these filmmakers. So how much do filmmakers' sensibilities affect a film musician's composition?
Oh, it does affect a lot, and Ilaiya has acknowledged this. He says, that when he started composing, there was a pattern that at the end of every scene, in a film, there would be a loud music like trumpet or tang, like that. It was like a kind of an exclamation mark. That's how they used to score the background score. It was like what you do in theater,
Yes,
nadagam that you call it in Tamil. And
yes,
he was not comfortable with that, but he had to go along with it. So then, when these directors like Mahendra and Balu Mahendra, Bharti Raja, they happened, then he found that he was in sync with their thinking, and he could break out of this. So whenever there is a big change, it is always the directors and the composers going together. It can't be the composer all by himself, because the composer in the overall context of film is not that powerful. He doesn't define the agenda of the film. It's the director and the producer who define it. So they have to be willing to take these risks in the first place. So again, Ilaiya also, in his own way, came at the right place, at the right time, the right place. The other thing that I haven't talked about in the book is that all this progressive rock, funk, it hadn't really happened in the 50s or the 60s. So even if Ilaiya had wanted to experiment, the tools from a Western perspective weren't available the same way that they were in the 70s. And again, recording was so bad in the 50s, because we just didn't have the money at the time in India. By 70s, you could get stereophonic recordings. So they were all very important. Without stereophonic recordings, how will you hear the independent bass lines that Ilaiya is writing? You won't be able to hear it. So he needed all those things to fall into place. So it's not, you can't, people single out Rahman a lot of times, saying he was in the right place at the right time, but that actually is true to a large extent for Ilaiya also. It's also true for R.D. Burman. In the at the beginning of the 60s, people wouldn't have been tired of the Shankar Jaikishan Rafi sound, but by the late 60s, they were ready for something different. That the audience also has to want something different. Because even Ilaiya used to once in a while try songs that had only English lyrics start to finish, and he gave a song to Sharon Prabhakar. So it's not like he was like this dodgy guy who was fixated on certain singers only. It's the kind of myth that Rahman fans like to spread about him, but that's not necessarily true. He did try these one-off experiments, but he never had the success with that Rahman did in the 90s, because by the 90s things had changed. People were ready for that. So that has to happen. So again, like, You could say even like Godfather, if it came in the 50s or the 60s, maybe it wouldn't have been such a big success that it became in the 70s. Yeah.
I never liked it. I, Goodfellas is my favorite movie about the
Oh
mafia.
yeah, yeah. I mean, so again, that Taxi Driver. You can't imagine a film like Taxi Driver necessarily becoming successful in any era. In the
Yeah,
1970s, it had a particular relevance, especially to the condition of New York at that time. So that contributed to its success. Otherwise, yeah, it can't exist in a vacuum. Basically, that's what I'm trying to say. Art does respond to what's happening around it, and that's the same for composers also.
so another interesting thing is, right, if you look at, take a layman's perspective, he would say the 50s and 60s in Hindi music is the Rafi era, and the
Yeah.
70s and 80s are the Kishore era. But your approach to music takes the composer as the supreme because you focus on the composer and his composition style. So I wanted to ask you with an example maybe, how much do you think a singer contributes to a song and versus how much a composer contributes?
Okay, so that question really depends on which song
Right.
specifically,
So let
oftentimes.
me give an
So,
example. You know the song from Brahmachari called Dil Ke Jharoke Mein Tujhko Bithake?
yes, yes.
Yes. So with
So,
that
yeah,
song, that's a Shankar Jayakishan Rafi song.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
with Shankar Jaikishan and Rafi, in general, I would say it's 50-50.
Right.
It's at least 50% contribution of Shankar Jaikishan because they're pushing him into a certain direction and
Yeah.
making him sing in a particular style. And you could notice the difference when he started singing for R.D. Burman. Even on Tisri Manzil, Rafi didn't sound as comfortable as he would sound on Evening in Paris, which actually came after Tisri Manzil. Because
Yeah.
the R.D. Burman's beats and the space, or rather the lack of space that he was giving between words, between beats, that was not so comfortable for Rafi. That doesn't mean that he couldn't sing it, but he wasn't able to just exhale and breathe the way he could on an SJ song. And so with SJ, I would say it's definitely SJ Rafi, it's 50-50 at least. But if you talk about someone like a Sony Komi, you know, it's one of any of those kind of less second tier composers that you call them, or
Yeah.
Chitragut, then I would say that their Chitragut again, Jag Dile Diwan, I think is a fantastic song. But if you talk about Ye Parbaton Ke Daire Mein, I would say Rafi Lata's contribution is very, very important. It's there, the equation tilts more to 70-30 at least, 70 in favor of the singer and 30% to the composer. And then you go to the 80s, then there are actually songs that are really not that great, but Kishore has sung the heck out of it. So then it gets up to maybe almost 90%. Again, sorry to bring up that guy, but if you imagine Kumar Sanu singing that song, then the attraction of it probably drops a good deal compared to Kishore singing it because the style wasn't that different. It actually just carried over into the 90s. But it was Kishore singing them that made them sound different.